Welcome back to the Scholar Wealth Podcast. Today we have a listener question on inheriting a large real estate portfolio and how to think about illiquidity, ongoing management, long-term decisions. Then we'll turn to a question from a neurosurgeon navigating asset protection as both income and assets and exposure rise together, how to protect what's been built without overcomplicating things. We'll close with our From the Field segment today featuring Brian Higgins, master distiller at 1861 Distillery, for a conversation on what drives the value in bourbon, why age and price are often misunderstood, and how to engage with bourbon more intentionally, whether you're drinking, collecting, or just curious. So let's go ahead and get started with our first question. I inherited a portfolio of real estate when my dad passed unexpectedly last year. It includes a primary residence in Maryland, our family's vacation home, and 2 rental duplexes. Altogether, it's worth around $7 million, which is now about half of my net worth. I'm 46 and trying to figure out whether it makes sense to hold this much illiquid real estate long term. I have concerns about ongoing upkeep costs and management, but I also don't want to make a rash decision and miss out on future growth. How do I decide whether to keep, sell, or restructure? So I think the first thing to keep in mind with this is there's no urgency in this decision whatsoever. A common thing that I see is once an inheritance comes in, there's this immense weight that hits, and it's like you have to make decisions. You have to understand it. Fortunately, you're in a great position where you have some liquidity that's outside of the real estate. So while there are likely some ongoing holding costs of this, it's not likely breaking the bank for you to hold on to it as you make this decision. So that's a huge advantage. I think the first thing you have to do with is really separate. You have 3 totally different types of properties that you're dealing with. I would look at the easy one first, which is the duplexes, and start looking at the duplex as an evaluation as possible investments. And the reason I say that is we likely don't have a lot of emotional ties to the rental properties. So those are the easiest to go through first and look at this as a purely financial decision. So I would look at what the value of them are now, not only on what you could sell them for. You can engage an agent to talk about that and see what the properties similar value are going for. But I would look at ongoing net operating income, which essentially is going to be you looking at how much rental income you can provide or do these duplexes provide, and then taking out all the ongoing costs. This would be any types of condo fees, any types of maintenance, taxes, all of that, to see how much cash flow does this actually throw off every single year. And then I would mix in some of the capital expenditures that you're likely going to need in the future. In other words, there's a big difference of if you just have these duplexes and roofs were recently changed out, there's not a lot of condo association issues for capital improvements in the future. Everything's been updated inside. That's a very different decision than something that says, well, you're going to have to replace the HVAC units. You're going to have to deal with a new roof soon. The appliances inside are going to need to be updated in a few years. All of that needs to be taken into account so that you're comparing apples to apples here. And then look at it as an outside investor. After seeing all of that, would you go today and buy those duplexes? And if the answer is no, for whatever reason, because you don't want to invest in real estate, because they're going to need work, because of whatever reason, maybe they're not local to you, it's going to be a pain. If there's reasons why you wouldn't buy these as a investment anyways, then I would say that is a reason enough for you not to have them in your portfolio. And so even though they were given to you from the inheritance doesn't mean that you have to keep them. And it doesn't automatically mean they're good investments. You see this happen with houses all the time. Somebody says, well, I have my one house. We're going to move to another house and we're going to keep our old house as a rental property. It's like, well, just because you already owned it doesn't mean that it's a good rental property. Would you have bought that house as a rental before? And the answer is normally is no, that's not a rental house. So we have that same scenario here. So duplexes are first. They have hopefully no emotional attachment to them. We evaluate them just as pure emotion or pure real estate investment opportunity. And if you're not interested in investing in real estate, then we drop them out of the portfolio and I would go ahead and list those and get them going. Especially because with the lack of growth that's happened now, there's likely a step up in basis that happened. So you're not going to have any embedded gains that you're going to have to worry about. So that's first. The next 2 are the ones that you have the emotional ties or could possibly have the emotional ties to, which is the primary residence and the vacation home. So the primary residence, for the reason I just said, the odds of that primary residence actually being a solid investment property in your portfolio are likely low because normally there's more money put into a primary residence than there would be a rental property. In other words, if you were going in and replacing the appliances or the kitchen or replacing carpets or anything like that in a rental property versus a primary residence, the value of those are going to be very different and the quality of those are going to be very different. The type of carpet you put in a rental house is not going to be the same type of carpet you put in your primary residence. And if your dad had that in that situation as well, it likely means that you're not going to get the money out in a rental property for that primary residence as you would a true rental property asset. So that would be the other factor. Now, when we get into that, the question comes into if we assume that it's probably not going to be a great rental, then the personal connection, if you have any to the home, would be the next thing. Do you want to hold it? You likely have the assets, especially you sell the duplexes out of here, that you could likely maintain the holding costs. You're young in this prime earnings years. So I don't see it being a problem if you were to hold it. But the question would be, what are you holding for? You'd have to be holding it as a true like sunk cost in the sense of it's there. You're going to pay the money to own it and hold it until you decide what you're going to do with it later on, which can be fine. But I would really start balancing out whether or not the value of that home could be put to better use in your other portfolio or in other types of investments, especially if you say, well, I don't mind investing in real estate. This is probably not the real estate investment that you want to jump into. The interesting one of all three of these is the vacation home. Because a lot of people, when they look at inheriting a primary residence of their parents, generally what we don't hear often is, I inherited my parents' home, I'm going to move in. That's not the issue. But the vacation homes have a different spin. When someone says, we inherited my parents' vacation home, then it's sometimes has the pitch of, well, now that's our vacation home because it is in a good location and it's a location we've gone to, or maybe you had gone there throughout your life or with your family. The vacation home is one that I would consider kind of a hybrid between the two. I would evaluate whether or not you want a vacation home there. If the answer is yes, then you could consider keeping the vacation home. And if you wanted to rent it out sometimes to help offset costs, you'd always have that option. Huge red flags there of making that the only option. I'd make sure that you could hold that vacation home with your own personal finances without having to rely on rental income to pay for it. But that's the way I'd look at the vacation home. Um, the reason I would say making sure that's a place that you want it to be is because if you want a vacation home somewhere else, you can always sell that home and go buy a vacation home for it. So it doesn't have to be I inherited a vacation home and it has to be in this location. You can still inherit the value of a vacation home and go put that vacation home somewhere else where you and your family would be able to enjoy it a little bit more. I think overall here, as I mentioned, you kind of have a pecking order of going through the duplexes first and the primary residence and the vacation home. But with your assets, with the ease of creating some liquidity here on some of these other properties, especially the duplexes, I wouldn't be too worried about holding this a little bit longer for you to make a good decision and take all these factors into account. So our next question. I'm a neurosurgeon. At this point, I have around $9 to $10 million across investments, retirement accounts, and ownership in my practice. I'm becoming more aware that my earning power and my exposure are increasing at the same time. I carry solid malpractice insurance, but a lot of my assets are still held personally in my taxable accounts. How do I balance protecting what I built without overcomplicating things or locking myself into limited flexibility? So a couple big things are standing out immediately on this is already included in that 9 to 10 million is ownership in the practice. That worries me a little bit because depending on how much of that 9 to 10 million is wrapped up in an illiquid asset such as the practice, I'm a little hesitant to go and say, well, let's go lock up a bunch of this other assets in some more illiquid things. And you're stuck with a huge liquidity crunch, making good money and not being able to spend anything because you have no assets to live with. You have $10 million on paper, but you can't touch any of it. That's a concern. So when we're talking about adding types of protection to your assets, we want to think about protection a few different ways. Everyone thinks of the normal. Obviously, malpractice is completely necessary. It's not sufficient as a coverage because there's other types of risks we're trying to hedge against. Malpractice insurance is absolutely necessary from a professional liability perspective, but from a personal liability protection, you'd likely want to throw some sort of umbrella policy on top of this. So you'd want to throw some umbrella policy for things like if an auto accident or somebody gets hurt on your property or defamation or something like that, where you go above those normal insurance limits. So making sure insurance coverage is solid for your normal things where you're more likely to have exposure. Cars, home, right, any type of other properties, those are going to be big. So protect those. You're protected on the malpractice side. You have umbrella insurance come in and protect for some other personal liability. I would start there before you start getting overly complex, which I think is your concern as well. It's really easy to get into this situation, realize that assets are going up, income's going up, and your exposure is absolutely going up. But it's easy to fall into the trap of saying, hey, there's more here to lose. So I keep seeing these irrevocable trusts, or I see these fancier types of protection ideas where I can go take $5 million, go throw it into an irrevocable trust. And now it's out of my hands. I don't control it. It's not me. So that's going to protect me on the legal side. And it does offer a significant amount of protection if you're to do that, especially if it's done correctly and within the right timing. But the reason it offers you that protection is because it's no longer yours. So you're moving $5 million or so out of your holdings into this irrevocable trust. Now you can sleep better at night because you don't have that in your account, but you also don't have that $5 million anymore. And this is the whole you can't have your cake and eat it too scenario. Well, talk to people and they say, well, I'm going to still have some control over that trust because I'm going to do these types of things and have these types of provisions. And that's fine. And there are lots of ways, there are endless ways to create different types of trust structures for your situation. And the problem is when you start putting all those little hooks into that trust, say, well, I could get the money out this way, or I could have income from the trust over here, or I could do this for my kids. Whenever you add all that, you're reducing that protection that the trust provided to begin with. So the more control, the more flexibility that you have when it comes to access to either the trust or income from that trust, you start to increase your exposure again. So this is where I would really encourage you to think about this as trying to figure out how much liquidity do you actually need? And not only now, but in the future, before you start getting rid of assets and adding this type of complexity, you really want to make sure that you don't need that liquidity and you don't need the money that you're about to go lock up somewhere else, especially from a legal protection perspective. So lots of good things here. You're already at the malpractice side, which is likely required anyways in your profession. So adding in some personal liability protection on the umbrella side, really do an evaluation of where your exposures are from personal liability, and then thinking about things like trusts only after you've established how much of this are you personally going to need. And we don't have your age here, so there's a difference of 9 to 10 million at 60, and you're looking at this as your retirement nest egg, and you're going to have to sell the practice to realize any of that liquidity versus you being at 40 and having 9 to 10 million there. Then I'd say we have a little bit more room to grow, and you might be able to remove some of this off of your balance sheet, essentially onto your kid's balance sheet or onto a trust balance sheet that is no longer putting you at risk. So great options there for you to jump into on the protection side. But I would just think about this holistically as opposed to just because you're in that field. If these scenarios sound like you, that's exactly the kind of planning work we do every day at Scholar Advising. Visit scholaradvising.com to see how we help families bring clarity to complex financial decisions. So next, we're going to turn to our From the Field segment and hear from someone who works with tangible assets every day. Today, we're joined by Brian Higgins, the master distiller at 1861 Distillery in Georgia. Brian works hands-on across the full bourbon making process and regularly engages with collectors and serious drinkers about what actually drives quality and enjoyment. Brian, welcome to the Scholar Wealth Podcast. To give us a little bit of your background, how you got into this business.
All right. Well, thank you so much for inviting me and allowing me to be on your show this morning. I'm a retired Air Force officer. I kind of took a hobby and turned it into a job. I've always used my hands my entire life growing up. So this was just kind of a natural fit to take something I enjoyed doing small scale, kind of increase the size of it. And once you started creating these, everything we use is 100% from nature, from the grain, the water, the yeast, the barrels. So every aspect of what we do is all nature driven. So it's fun to take something that's grown in the ground or harvested, it's gone through the entire process and make this wonderful spirit that we call bourbon today.
When you talk about that, because you look at something that comes kind of naturally sourced and you have all these different types of flavors and everything, different profiles that come out of it, what actually drives quality then? When you look at one bottle versus another, what things do you see kind of overemphasized? What things actually matter from a distiller perspective?
Yeah, and quality in a bourbon is really it's really defined long before the label is ever printed. It's often before the barrel's filled. It starts with sourcing the right grains, coming up with a grain bill that makes a balanced perspective that makes sense. The water is probably one of the most key ingredients. Almost every distillery brags about their water sources. And then everything from, are you mashing it? Once you're done through the mashing process, are you running it at the right temperatures? Are you not overheating the grains? Are you taking the time? Everything we do is steeped in tradition. So after the mashing process, are you adding a lot of yeast and trying to push through that fermentation in 2 or 3 days? Or are you letting it naturally kind of take its process over 5 to 7 days? Then after that, are you stripping the grains, the liquid off the grains, and then distilling that, or are you distilling on the grains? There's a lot of aspects, all the way up to barrel selection, the char levels, actually whether the wood itself is kiln dried or allowed to air dry for 2 to 3, maybe even as long as 4 years before that barrel's made. There's hundreds of things that go into making a quality bourbon. And it's when you find that right key, when you find that right measure of, hey, I think we've got this right, truly, you have a good bourbon when you see a customer pick up and try your whiskey or your bourbon for the first time and you just see that smile erupt onto their face. You've done your job correctly.
That is the distiller's answer right there. That is
That's
no, as an amateur in this field, right? How do I get any of that from looking at what bottle I should be buying? Right. So if you're telling me sounds great, right? And I hear everything you said. I know there's a lot of work that goes into it, but that all happens before the label. Once the label goes on, so what things should I be looking for? Then how can I as an amateur connoisseur here of bourbon, or Dion's over here trying to convince me I should throw like 5% of my portfolio in bourbon, and that would be reasonable as a commodity here.
And
What does that look like? How do I pick a bottle?
and you used the word amateur, but yeah, I wouldn't say anybody's really an amateur. You're going to like what you like, but if you're walking into a store for the first time and you really don't know where to start, I tell everybody, the first thing you need to do is get educated on reading the label. Did that bottle you pick up, was it actually manufactured by that distillery? It's surprising to me in today's age, with the technology and everything we have, how many distilleries still don't make their own spirit. They come from, like, well, I won't mention companies' names, but they're sourcing their spirits from another distillery. They bottle it and label it and call it their own. And don't get me wrong, they're good, but I feel like, if you're wanting something that's been truly handcrafted, you need to learn how to read the label to make sure it says distilled and bottled by, and it has that distillery's name on it. At that point, they've had 100% control of that process from sourcing the grains all the way up to putting that label on. It's always nice to know who makes it, what's the passion behind it, what's the story behind, where did that bottle come from? What drove somebody to want to create that bourbon? And you get that with that distilled and bottled by on the label. You can always call that distillery or walk in and say, "Hey, I have some questions." And man, they're 99% of the time they're happy to sit down and talk to you about it. So I always say start off with your distilled and bottled by labels.
was gonna ask, when I buy a bottle, is sometimes the case that that company bought the mash bill, put it in their own barrels and aged it themselves, and and I assume some other companies buy the barrel and then, or somebody has aged it for them and they're putting it in the bottle and slapping their label on it.
Mhm.
Is it true I can see all three, somebody like yourself who takes it all the way, the value chain in some sense goes all the way to the bottle, and there are these other intermediate steps as well? Is that the case?
Yes, and you're hitting the nail right on the head there. That You've got distilleries who will source it from another vendor that's already completed. It's already finished. They just buy the barrel. They may blend a couple barrels together to call it their blend, and then they're going to label it. You've got some that buy it already finished. They put it in barrels, and then they finish aging it out. And then you've got the ones who create it from start to finish.
And there's no way for me, I mean, how can I tell? I mean, how if I'm in my local store and I'm doing that, right? How, and especially, right, if I'm buying a really big name, maybe I know, right? If I'm buying a famous one, but there's a lot of bourbon on my bourbon aisle, right? I mean, so many. How do I possibly tell which ones are crafted the way you talked about it so passionately,
Mhm.
and some other company who maybe isn't doing as much and putting their own spin on what the bourbon is that I'm going to drink?
And that's where learning how to read that label is key to figuring that out. You'll see bottled at, or bottled at or bottled by, and it'll have that distillery's name on it. Yeah, produced by. What you want to see is, it's distilled or produced and bottled at that distillery. Or produced doesn't mean that they literally distilled it there. It can mean it was produced at another location and bottled there. It's the TTB rules and regulations on bottling can be tough to try to determine what you're really getting. That's why if it says distilled and bottled by, you're always 100% getting it by them. That can be a challenge until you've done it a few times. It's fun actually to walk in liquor stores and see how some people get very creative with trying to skirt around that. I've got one that says bottled by and it has their name on it and it doesn't say where it's distilled. But if you look, there's a little tiny, you can barely read it. It says DSP-IN- and it's got the rest of which that tells me that it was distilled at that DSP location, which is in Indiana, not down here in the South at all. Distilled is the key. That's the magic word that you're looking for on that bottle.
So if I'm looking at this big aisle of bourbon, right, and I'm trying to pick out which ones I'm adding to a collection or starting a collection with something, and somebody's looking at this, are there good rules of thumb besides reading every bottle in there? Because what I normally hear is you just go for the highest price one and you look for age, and something's a 18-year bottle. That's got to be better than the 12-year bottle sitting next to it. And if it's more expensive, then maybe that's the one I add to a collection.
Well,
Is
and
there any rough truth to that, or is that completely wrong?
and that's what the secondary market really wants you to believe is that, you know, price perceives value, value precedes, what's inside the bottle, that it's going to be an excellent product to sell. You can't confuse price with worth. The, they're living off of things like hype, scarcity, speculation. It shifts attention from the liquid to the label. Marketing does an amazing job of telling you that you need to buy this product.
So are there any undervalued ones out there right now that you'd look at and say, this one is a good value to cost ratio for a collector that in 5-10 years, it's going to get some more appreciation?
That's like asking me which stock's going to go up today. I wish I knew. But there's one way to kind of look at what you're asking there is your big brand names. For the most part, it's easy to pick up their bottle because there's going to be hundreds of them, usually in a lot of large liquor stores. You can look at it and see if it just says distilled by. But if you're picking up a 12-year bottle versus an 18-year bottle, they're going to taste completely different. And it doesn't mean it should be valued at a higher price because, yes, when you take in the cost of how much evaporates out of the barrel over the time that it's aged that additional 6 years, you're going to have less bottles. But it doesn't necessarily mean it tastes better than the 6-year, 10-year, 8-year, because then when you get into it, what size barrel did they age that in? Did they age it in a 53-gallon barrel, which is the traditional size barrel for aging, and you're looking at 6 to 8 years for the most part to find a good bourbon? Or somebody like us who, we're a smaller scale distillery and we age in 5-gallon and 10-gallon and 30-gallon barrels. And when you get the smaller barrel, you've got a surface to volume ratio that's different than that 53-gallon barrel. You've got a lot more wood touching the spirits, and it really ages out in about 8 to 9 months for us. In a 5-gallon barrel, the 10-gallon barrel ages out in 18 to 19 months. Arguably, you're getting more flavor and more color out of that smaller barrel because the wood to spirit ratio. But tradition says you use a 53-gallon barrel and you sit around and wait. But we have won a lot of awards, and we've had a lot of large distilleries look at our small barrel program. It doesn't make sense for them cost-wise because that little 5-gallon barrel is half the price of a 53-gallon barrel. So in the economy of scale, they want to fill 53-gallon barrels, and they've got time to wait. But I would argue a very strong point that smaller barrels can provide more flavor. They can provide more mouthfeel. They can give you, more of a value when it comes to taste and, what you're actually going to sit down and enjoy. So I said, it's kind of a tricky game. There's a lot of questions, a lot of really fun answers.
So if you were to go, if someone were to start to build a collection, they wanted to allocate a percentage of their portfolio to bourbon investing and wanted to start building out a collection here, give us what what 1861 bottle they should be looking at to add to this collection, and then Right. 3 or 4 others that you think would be good options for someone building out a collection there that would be solid. Where if you walked into a room and you walked into Dion's bourbon cellar here and you looked on the wall and you said, "That's a good bottle right there. That's pretty awesome that you have that one in there." What would that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. And when you talk about collecting, there's kind of two different versions of that to me at least. You've got collecting, which is about the curation of it, and then you've got the investing side of it. You've got collectors that are motivated by kind of rarity and craftsmanship. And then you've got investing, which is, hey, I'm buying bottles looking at, if I pay $250 for it now, is it going to be worth 500 next year or a couple years down the road? And, you know, on collectors, a lot of times you'll see they may even buy multiple bottles because they want to consume one or two, and then they want to keep the others for collecting. Whereas investors, a lot of times, never open the bottles. I look at from 1861 distillery from our aspect, and I love, just our regular two bourbons have won just about any award that we've ever sent it off to. But I like the fact, we do what they call like a honey barrel pick. When we take down several barrels, if one barrel stands above and beyond the rest of the barrels, and it's all the same spirits that are going into that run of barrels, but you'll get a barrel that, it's going to be comprised of somewhere between 30 to 33 staves. Each one of those staves could represent a different oak tree. And sometimes, these trees may be 30 years old. They could be 130 years old. This one was grown in sandy soil. This one was grown in, you know, you know, up there, on the mountaintop. So it's, every once in a while you get that one barrel that just stands out above and beyond. And that's what we pull as our single barrels. We don't even filter them. They go through just a strainer to pull the charcoal out, and then it goes straight into the bottle. So it's as close as you can get to literally sitting down with me and pulling a bung out and sampling that barrel. So I would say any of our single barrel picks are always amazing to keep from a collecting standpoint, or, even an investment, because we do label, or on the label, we write which batch is from and the bottle number out of it. And, from batch to batch, they're going to taste different, just kind of like a wine does from year to year. Because like I said, that one barrel is the one that we pull from. Sometimes, we may go months without pulling a single barrel. So they are kind of rare and they're more scarce. Outside of 1861 Distillery, I don't want to name any brands per se, but I would say, look for companies that are doing the one-offs, the things that are hard to find, or they've got that one special barrel pick. For example, we've got what's coming up for next year. We have we're calling it America 250. And it's a whiskey that we made that was comprised of a red, white, and blue corn. And we made this grain bill just specifically for celebrating the 250th anniversary of the United States. So kind of like they did with the bicentennial coins back in the 200-year anniversary, we're doing a special whiskey just for the 250th anniversary. So that would be a fun bottle to collect because we're only going to release a small amount of them. And once they're gone, there's not another 250 after that. And then really from us, we do something kind of above and beyond what other distilleries do. Just about every distillery has what you can go in and do a barrel pick. They'll take you in, show you around, you pull out a bung or two, or they'll drill holes in it and pull samples, and you say, hey, that's the one I want. But we take that to the next level. Since we're a small distillery, we're doing a program called Barrel Privé, and this is really geared towards the people who want a bourbon experience that you can't get anywhere else in the world. It's exclusive to that individual or that company. You can't walk into any liquor store or other distillery anywhere in the world and get it. And what we do is we actually work with that individual, kind of find out where their flavor profile's at. And I develop grain bills specifically for them. And then from that process, they're allowed, if they want to, they can come in and help grind the grains. They can go through the mashing process, the distillation process.
Yeah.
They design their label.
You're making Dion summer plans. You're filling up the.
I'm thinking about SFA barrel. That's what I'm thinking about.
Yeah. And it's fun because we've had a plantation that just said, Brian, make me a bourbon I want to serve to our exclusive guests when they come in for these quail hunts. And then we've had individuals that, I want to come in, I want to be involved in the entire process. And they are from start to finish. They get to come in and sample their barrels throughout the process. And it's fun to see because they take such an ownership in the process and such an ownership in that barrel. I mean, when they walk out of the barrel room, they turn around and look back at the barrel like they're leaving a kid behind or something. And it becomes that personalized to them. But what's fun is they end up with about 100 bottles at the end. And like I said, they can design their own label or we'll help them, but we make sure it meets all the TTB requirements. And then, it gets bottled. They can literally sit here, stand right beside me and help put labels on. And when it's said and done, they own that grain bill. I actually sign it, put it in a frame, and I will not make that recipe again without their permission. And we use,
Awesome.
yeah. And it makes it fun because, almost was it around 98% of the bourbons in the United States are made out of corn, malted barley, and wheat or rye. We just did you can't see it down here on the floor. There's some barrels that we just filled for Monday that are getting ready to go back on the shelf, but they've got 7 grains in them. And we've used as many as, well, we'll talk about that whiskey, but it's got 20 something different grains in it, but it's its own unique animal. It was a fun experiment. But we use a lot more than just your traditional 3 grains, and we find that you'll get more mouthfeel out of it. You're getting more of a tasting experience out of it because you're getting more than just corn, wheat, malted barley, or rye. So that's why I can make just hundreds of grain bills, and I really can scale them to what that person, what they're looking for taste-wise. So that Barrel Privé program is a fun program. It lets me be creative, and it lets the end user literally get hand in hand. They can sit in here and get dusty and dirty with us to put the label on, or they can say, hey, just make me a bourbon that nobody else in the world has.
My question is, when you pull that and call it a single barrel, I've always wondered, a lot of times when I go to the store and get a single barrel, it has a higher proof, right?
Mhm.
And so not always, but that's what I generally see when I'm choosing. Why is that, right? I mean, I don't know enough to know that. So I see the single barrel and it's say running at 125 proof versus 90 or 100 for my standard, you know, normal bourbon. Why is that by chance?
It's kind of a standard because that barrel kind of stands on its own. Its flavor profile is just better than everybody around it. They want to leave all that there. They don't want to, they don't want to dilute that flavor down. They want to leave it straight out of the barrel. Now theirs is probably going to get filtered. I don't know if they're cold chilling them or not, stripping the fats molecules out of it or not. But yeah, that barrel just stands on its own and they want to leave it that higher proof. They're giving you, essentially the spirit right out of that barrel.
The other thing that I've always found fascinating about the bourbon market is, Stefan and I, as economists, would look at it and say price should be the thing that, price should adjust so that demand and supply sort of equilibrate, right? That's what the classic story is. And I've noticed in the bourbon market that doesn't appear to happen, right? I mean, bourbons that I want that I think should cost a lot more because the supply is completely constrained, the prices don't move to that, at least the retail prices. Are they doing that just to build this notion of scarcity so that I want it even more, knowing that I'm going to have a hard time finding it?
Yeah, on the secondary market they're great at measuring demand, but they're not so good at measuring quality. So it comes down to, a lot of aspects, but they can build in an artificial scarcity to drive that price up. If you walk into a liquor store and you're used to seeing, a whole shelf full of XYZ company, and you walk in and there's 2, you're going to be like, oh my gosh, I better go ahead and get this one or both of these because, hey, they're almost gone. So they can build in that artificial scarcity. But there are times actually when, there's a lull in production or that distillery, maybe maybe COVID slowed them down for, 6 months or a couple years, and it took them a while to get everything back up and running again. So they may actually have, a real scarcity built into it, but you've got marketing really drives a lot of that pricing. Something gets, as we call it, hot in the industry. Like Tito's was very hot for a while and it just skyrocketed, went through the roof in the vodka market. But we've had the same thing happen in the bourbon industry where large bourbon groups will jump onto that one product and they're like, man, it's the hot item. Well, it went from $29 a bottle to $109 a bottle. And the secondary market will pull back on how many of those are putting on the shelf to drive that scarcity so they can make that extra profit because they're probably still paying or close to that original price rate. So they're able to mark that up to that price and make all that, that extra revenue. So a lot of that can happen. There's always as I call it, the hype, the scarcity, and the speculation of it. So, to answer your question, yes, a lot of that can be driven by the secondary market and making things appear to be scarce on the back end. However, the big five manufacturers last week said they're sitting on a lake of bourbon that they cannot sell right now. So that artificial, scarcity may be coming back to haunt them a little bit right now, because when they had the opportunity to get it out on the shelves, they didn't take it. So, it's an accordion effect across the board.
So if they're sitting on a lake of bourbon, the classic story from an investing standpoint would be if they have to distribute that bourbon out, now would be the time to buy then and put it away in the hopes that maybe over time that lake dissipates. And so you've bought low and you're going to sell high, or since they can adjust production, you can't really do that.
Well, I think
I wonder
the
about
other
that.
option would be, could they go sell that to other type of distillers or other bottlers, right? And bottle it under a different name. They sell it at a lower price, so it doesn't affect the scarcity of their bottles, and they're
Right.
still able to make somewhat of a profit on
So
the
right, and
excess.
so it means investing is in this market is really hard, right?
Yeah.
Because they can move supply around, and it's not like
Well, it's not commoditized either,
right.
so then
It's
you have a
right. Copper is copper is copper is copper,
yeah.
and that's not true for bourbon here. So you just made the story a lot harder for me to understand, to be perfectly honest.
And there's a lot of things they can do with that excess bourbon. You keyed on several of them there, but it's easy to bring back an old label that hadn't been seen in the marketplace for years, and take one of the spirits they've already got, age it for an extra 6 months, and call it that new label, and push it out and make it a new hot item. Or they slow down production, and instead of being a 6-year-old bourbon, they leave it in the barrels for 7 years, 8 years, 9 years, 10 years. And then they're just going to, every year add on a couple dollars more and make it a more exclusive, a longer age statement on that label. So there's a lot of things they can do. There's a lot of outlets they can do. It's I would say right now, we went through COVID, more alcohol is being consumed, and man, that I know of since I've been alive. But now, in the last really 2 to 3 years, you've got a different generation of people coming up behind us, and you've got different mindsets on alcohol. So we're finding that, people, and then, with the finances people have right now, they don't have that extra $400, $500, $600 in their back pocket at the end of the month anymore, due to the inflation that we, suffered through the last however many years. So what we find now is people, instead of buying that, they're kind of, they're taking taste and quality over, really, the run of the mill spirits. People are reaching out and going, hey, if I'm only going to buy this one bottle and I'm going to hold on to it for a little while, they're willing to pay a little bit extra more, a little extra money to buy that bottle, because they know that they're going to sit down and they're not just going to drink it over the course of one night. They're going to just go get them one cocktail out of that, or one drink out of it, maybe once a week or once a month. So they're really going to kind of savor on that bottle. These different mindsets that we're working with right now, they're really about quality more than they are quantity anymore.
You mentioned the cost of this going up. Have you experienced quite a bit of inflation on input costs into your bourbons over the past few years from inflation?
We experienced a good little price increase during COVID, because me being a logistician of the Air Force, I could kind of see it coming. So I had reached out and I'd ordered surplus yeast, surplus bottles. I had everything kind of here, so it really didn't affect us much. But a lot of our friends that own distilleries really struggled through it. They would literally run out of bottles, or they had just had to stop production altogether. But to answer your question, really, it hasn't affected us much. If anything, we've lowered the price on a few of our bottles, but we haven't raised our prices since we've opened in 4 years.
That's interesting. That's great.
Mhm.
And as we wrap up, to anything that you want to add into, this has been a very educational conversation. I've learned
So
a lot.
cool.
I have to rethink
So
my thoughts
cool.
around this. Anything else that you'd like to add or throw in there on what listeners should know about when they're thinking about either bourbon in general or collecting?
I'd say bourbon in general is bourbon is bourbon. If you find a couple labels that you really enjoy, share them with your friends. One of our little trademark things is called history in a bottle. We say when you buy that expensive bottle and you're sitting on that and you open it for special occasions, take you a little Sharpie or a pen and write on that bottle who you shared it with and the date on it. And 6 months from now or 2 years from now or 5 years from now, when that bottle's empty, you've got a little piece of history. You've got a talking point sitting up there in your bourbon collection. So we always say, just, it takes a lot of work to produce a bottle of bourbon. And we just say, enjoy it, whether that's in a cocktail, whether it's neat with an ice cube, however you enjoy it, just sit down and enjoy it. And from the investing standpoint, have fun with it also. The risk is worth the reward. Find the one-offs, find the barrel privés of the world, find your single barrels, and, find something that you're going to enjoy and just have fun with it.
Love it. I was going to say one thing I love about it is people who have everything, I tend to give them bourbon as gifts, right? Because it's one of those kind of things they can't easily replicate, right? They can go buy any kind of coat or that sort of thing, or article of clothing. But if I give somebody a rare-ish bourbon that they can't just walk out and buy, then they know, I think it's pretty great. They know I thought about it and that it represents the kind of gift that, is personal. And so I love your idea of writing on the bottle who you shared it with. I learned a lot today. Thank you.
Yes, it's great.
Well, and I won't take credit for all that. I will say that Freddie Johnson from Buffalo Trace shared that idea with me. He had, long story short, he had got a bottle from the distillery, shared it with his dad, and he said that was the last drink they'd ever had together before he passed away. And he said that was something he had kind of started doing. And I thought, man, that is such a great idea. So we've started kind of the same thing here at our house.
Yes, it's great.
Yeah, that's good. See, I know what I'm getting for Christmas now from Dion. Once he bottles all of his bottles here, I get the Strickland special.
Absolutely, the Strickland pick.
Yeah, there you go, the Strickland pick. So, well, thank you very much, Brian. Appreciated you coming on and learned a lot. We have a great
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Look forward to talking again.
All right, bye-bye.
That's our show. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week. Hey, this is Stefan Scheid. Thanks for tuning in to the Scholar Wealth Podcast. If you have a question you'd like us to tackle on a future episode, share with us at scholaradvising.com/podcast. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time.
The information provided in this podcast is for general informational and educational purposes only and is not intended to constitute financial, investment, or other professional advice. The opinions expressed are those of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect the views of any affiliated organizations. Investing in financial markets involves risk, including the potential loss of principal. Past performance is not indicative of future results. Before making any investment decisions, you should consult with a qualified financial advisor who can assess your individual financial situation, objectives, and risk tolerance. Thanks for listening.